Well, hello and a very warm welcome to another in our series of our Choice Words videos, where we get to speak to some of the key decision makers in the wonderful world of fund selection and fund research and find out what makes them tick. I'm Julian Marr, I'm editorial director of Wealthwise Media, and today I'm delighted to be talking to the Chief Investment Officer of Portfolio Metrics, Alex Funk. Alex, how are you?
Great to be here. Thanks, Julian.
No, it's a pleasure to have you. One thing I've learned from the first batch of these that we filmed is that my intros went on way too long. So let's go nice and easily, move away from that and into the first question. What excites you about the current investment outlook? What gives you pause for thought? What worries you?
I think maybe if we start with the worrying, that will sort of lead us to the excitement to some extent. It's not a great worry, but it's something to be mindful of, right? And so we're seeing concentration becoming quite a theme within portfolios, right? And it's not just at an asset class level, but within asset classes as well. And so when we're seeing portfolio returns being driven by a smaller and smaller subset of asset classes, sectors, and I don't need to sort of hint further at which direction I'm going with this, that concerns me in the fact that it allows large bits of volatility to enter the portfolio. And that's when investors, their behavioral biases get triggered to some extent. So when we have large relative volatility or big movements away because of these concentration risks, behavioral biases can sneak in, and we have investors making the wrong decisions at exactly the wrong time. Right? And COVID is such a good example of exactly when you should have been buying equities when everyone was flocking to cash to some instance, right? So that worries me a little bit. But the world today is very different, right? So if we go back to the start of 2022, when I think was the last time we had severe volatility in both equity and bonds, starting yields were much lower, right? I mean, I had to go double check this, right? It's 1.5% was roughly the US 10-year going into 2022, right? Now you can buy it at 4.5%, right? So as a multi-asset investor, I have much more differentiated sources of return for my portfolio than I did a few years ago. So I think that excites me. Yields are much higher. There are sources of return. There's broadening out beyond Mag 7. This year is an excellent example of exactly how that can happen. If we look at equal-weighted S&P, if we look at small caps, if we look at mid caps relative to US tech sectors. So I think, always in the face of volatility, there's always opportunity, but be cognizant of how you bring that together in a portfolio.
Yeah, nice. You build to a high. Good, now we like that. Homing in on individual investments, I'd like to ask this question. What do you most look for in an individual investment, and what do you consider a red flag?
So I want to hone in on the red flag component, right? Because I think that's quite important. The whole asset management industry is designed to sell you a story, right? They'll come in and pitch you an idea, or the ability to forecast a macro outcome, or what Trump's policies will look like, tariffs, not tariffs, and the outcome of a Labour election, what that would mean for UK equities. This idea of crystal ball gazing to some extent, right? Identifying a theme before it is a theme. And that for me is an absolute red flag, right? So these things are very difficult to predict, A, and secondly, to predict the directionality of the market off that prediction is quite hard. So you need to be right twice. And you need to do that consistently in order to actually generate some excess return for investors. So if that's a red flag, what do we like in managers? We like managers that are focused on the risks of the asset class, right? Focused on the risk of equities, the fundamental risks of that, the industry that company operates in, its strengths, its weaknesses, its opportunities, and giving us exposure to that asset class risk rather than how the spat between China and the US works out, or when or if or at all the Fed continues to cut rates, right? Because those risks I can diversify away. What I can't diversify away is a Republican government's policy decisions over the next 6 months.
I'm just going to, there's a question just occurred, so forgive me to throwing this one in, but I think you, in both questions or both answers so far, you've touched on sort of behavioural biases, the human nature. What do you have within your own decision-making processes that sort of help to ward off the behavioural biases that we have as human beings?
I think by thinking about portfolio construction in a sort of loss aversion mindset, right? We all have, the pain we feel from losses versus the equivalent gain is much more. I actually met an advisor today who said he thinks it's about 7 times. Don't ask me how he got the number, but I thought that was really interesting. So how do we construct a portfolio where the reality meets expectation, right? Asset classes, predicting their returns going forward. If you ask me, Alex, do you think the S&P goes to 7,000 points this year? I don't know. Your guess is probably as good as mine. But if you say consistently the volatility is probably on average 10%, yeah, that's modelable, right? So if you think about your asset allocation in risk terms rather than in return expectations, return will be a function of being in the market ultimately. Now we can model. And when we can start telling clients this is how portfolios behave during certain periods in time, we're setting expectation. And when reality is within expectation, we're just squashing the opportunity for those behavioral biases to sneak in. So we spend a lot of time speaking to advisors, speaking to investors about these sort of concepts.
Okay, so thank you for that. To what degree should professional investors be thinking beyond the traditional bond secretaries cash towards so-called alternatives? And are there any particular areas of alternatives that you would be looking at?
So it's a perfect question leading on to what we've just discussed, right? So as a multi-asset investor, you have many different asset classes at your disposal. And I'd argue that you can be quite granular within that. You don't just have to say, oh, I have corporate bonds. You have short-dated corporate bonds, you have investment grade, you have high yield, you have emerging market debt, and so on and so forth. So as an investor, you have to decide which of those asset classes you want to include in your portfolio. And you have to answer sort of two fundamental questions. One is, what is the purpose that serves in the portfolio? And secondly, is it additive, right? Is it adding return or is it decreasing risk, volatility, adding diversification? To do that, you need to have a representative index, right? Your starting point as an investor would be the index, right? And then taking a view off of that index, whether it be active, whether it be passive, whatever that might be. But if you cannot model that index consistently through time, you can't understand how that asset class will behave during rapid interest rate increases or during periods of inflation shocks. It's kind of hard to understand how that's going to behave in a portfolio context. So when it comes to the world of alternatives, find an alternative asset class if you want to include it, understand the purpose in the portfolio, if it's additive in risk or return, and then find an index that you can model off the back of that. It becomes quite difficult because there aren't many indices within the space for, say, trend following or hedge funds that don't have any other issues alongside survivorship bias and all these sorts of aspects as well. Secondly, they're going to eat into other parts of your portfolio, right? So if you're going to add in something that is lowly correlated to equities, you're going to have to take from the bond portfolio. Do you want to take for the bond portfolio at 4.5% US Treasury yields? Question mark, right? And so just understand why you want to include it in the portfolio. So I think there's space for it, but I think for the asset classes that have a long track record that we can model, we can understand how they're going to behave, and then take it from the parts of the portfolio where it is going to be additive ultimately.
Awesome, thank you for that. Moving on to client communications, as a journalist, I'm biased, but I do think it is obviously so important. What drives the portfolio metrics approach or your own approach to client comms? Do you see a need to sort of how do you bring the clients along the journey so that they don't jump off a couple of stops too early and therefore miss all the good stuff?
Yeah, it's such an important thing. It's something we've been discussing so much as a business, but I think the entire investment management industry is filled with way much too complexity and lots of jargon, right? This is not helping clients, by the way. This is not helping sort of alleviate any of their concerns around investments. And you just sort of got to take a step back and say, but why? Why do we write like this? Why do we want to use terms like Sharpe ratios and drawdowns and optimization models? This is justification of fees, right? Like what is it that you feel compelled as an expert to write like that? So everything we do, we put in the sort of in the retail mindset saying, maybe it's not even the advisor that's going to consume this, understands it and adds benefit to them. So write about the things that matter. Right? And pro tip, that's not about the latest GDP releases or the inflation print or the key drivers of that. So write about things that are interesting. Secondly, in a post-COVID world, I mean, we have such short spans of attention, right? This sort of clickbait, this constant turning, this scrolling, all of that. We're struggling to read, right? We're struggling to consume this information. So delve into different ways of communication, like this podcast. Fantastic, right? It's a good way to meaningfully communicate with your clients in a way that they can consume it on the train, in the car. Videos, short, snappy, 60-second videos, what's happening in the markets, how the portfolio is positioned, and embrace technology. We're embracing avatars. Right? There'll be avatars of the Portfolio Metrics team. We can get information out much quicker. Under no circumstance would we ever try and tell an investor that this is not us, right? It is clearly an avatar of us, but it allows us to more efficiently, quickly communicate information in a consumable fashion.
Well, that's one to watch. Sorry, I'm just got this image of you guys as a tall blue with tails, but that's not the avatar in mind, is it?
Maybe
That's
we'll
only-
get one of the avatars on the show.
Yeah, more personal question. What was your path into investment? And in a parallel universe, what would you be doing if you hadn't done that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was lucky enough while I was studying financial analysis at the University of Stellenbosch to write my CFA exams as well. So I always knew investment finance was the pathway, but it was never sort of clear which part of the industry I would land up in. So I did lots of different things across finance. So spent some time at an audit firm I do not recommend for most. Did lots of work in the corporate finance, M&A, equity funding, private banking, and then went completely left field and joined as a financial advisor in a small wealth management firm in Johannesburg. And it's only there that you truly understand what the purpose a solutions provider fulfills, right? When you're at the coalface, sitting with a client, building out that financial plan, understanding that their greatest risk is shortfall risk, right? The ability for them to not achieve their goals is their greatest risk. So risk is so important, how you construct portfolios in order to achieve that risk, and ultimately the journey that they go on through that portfolio to achieve those goals. And I think that's truly where the love for investments came in, and the way I sort of stumbled into the career. It's kind of hard to imagine being in any other industry at this point. But if I think about what are the key attributes I love about it, it's problem solving and creating solutions, right? So quite a boring answer, but maybe I would have been a management consultant of some sorts.
Oh, well, no, you had me at University of Stellenbosch. If I'd been at University of Stellenbosch, I don't think I'd have made it out of a wine tasting. I would have been just continuing in the vineyard.
I mean, winemaking was considered.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, what a great place to be. Anyway, great. Well, okay, well, no investment, always investment. But are you prepared to admit to any mistakes? What was your biggest that you're prepared to admit to, and did you learn anything from it?
Yeah, so it's probably not a single event, but a facet, right? And overconfidence is probably most people's Achilles heel.
Sure.
And sometimes when you're so close to an investment idea or a decision, your own behavioral biases quickly overshadow that, right? And it's almost when you sit back and you're saying, what could go wrong? It's actually at that point when it can go wrong. And so there are many times when you are often too close to an investment, and I'd say that would be some of the biggest mistakes. The things that you learn from that is that constructive debate in a team environment is absolutely critical, right? And that no one person is right all the time. That's literally why we're in multi-management, right? No one is right all the time. And so using the opportunity to sound this around the team, using that constructive debate, allowing for challenge really is a good way to overcome some of that. But always challenge yourself. When something feels too good, make sure you get a second opinion on some of that as well.
Next one's an odd question, but I don't care. It's my interview. Outside of work, what's the strangest thing you've seen or done?
So it's potentially not seen or done, but probably the thing that people least expect from me. So I mean, you saw me come into the podcast today. I'm a fairly large fellow as well, but no one would have guessed that I was a professional show jumper in South Africa. And for most of my junior career, competed at a very high level before I joined the professional fund management ranks. So yeah, there's a fun fact for you on something a bit strange from fund management.
International? No.
So locally in South Africa, but at the highest level.
Okay. Fair enough. Yep, that's strange enough. That'll do. Thank you for that. One more professional question. Not professional, show jumping. Investment. What's your wealth? What's your best and worst case scenarios for the future of wealth industry in the UK?
I feel my biggest concern for the industry is turning into a product-centric sausage factory style industry, right? Where all we're focusing on is doing as much to as many people as possible at the lowest possible price. And then we'll sort of move away from thinking strategically to thinking more transactionally. We'll move away from partnerships to focusing more on distribution channels. We'll have far less holistic conversations and much more narrow conversations. And I think the ultimate loser in all of this is going to be the investor. Because at some point when we compromise on that sort of relationship aspect and having a more product-centric focus, there's bound to be unhappiness. You cannot compete on a scale and quality franchise, right? If you want to scale, fees is the other side of that. If you want to have that quality, you need to have a substantial business model to be able to participate in. So I'm worried about the proliferation of wealth management in that space, and that it continually just drives down cost at the expense of quality, partnership and relationships. So that then therefore creates some excitement as well, because this creates opportunity, right? So how do we then move the wealth management industry that we can help more people? Because clearly there is a need for that, but technology now allows us to do that. So instead of seeing technology as a hassle in your business or another system you need to learn, it now needs to be seen as an enabler to the advice process, an enabler to those client discussions, an enabler to showing investors what they're invested in, to create that interaction with their portfolio so they stay invested for longer periods of time. Ultimately, let's bring the theatre of investments to retail investors, right?
Nice, good upbeat stuff. Last question then. We call this choice words because you're professional choices you make as a fund selector. However, now these are personal recommendations. We ask for, I say we, as a rule, I'm asking for one book choice, doesn't have to be investment, can be anything, and one that isn't a book, can be any sort of, we've had podcasts, restaurants, we've had experiences.
Fantastic. So the first one ties in neatly to some of the conversation we had, and it's something we're actively reading as a business, actually, and it's How to Build a Story Brand by Donald Miller.
Right.
So it basically says, people think in stories, right? So if you think about any movie you've watched, there's a hero who has a problem. This problem is typically a villain, meets a guide, provides a solution that ends in success, ultimately gets the girl, right? Most of us consume thinking in that pattern, right? So how do you take your proposition? How do we take what we do, right? And, the wealth managers or the advisors we work with ultimately being that hero. What's their key villains? It's clear non-core distractions, right? Spending time on compliance, managing their own portfolios, market volatility, compliance, consumer duty, you name it. So in comes the guy, right? The investment solutions manager that can help them resolve some of those issues and ultimately ends in a successful business, focus, something that can monetize at retirement, clear from distraction, going from being overwhelmed to in control, going from working, in the business to on the business. And so it helps us frame mindsets. So I've really, really enjoyed that. And I recommend that to anyone on the show if you really want to think about messaging in a way that people actually understand. And the second one, cheeky plug, but I always encourage everyone I meet in the UK that just go to South Africa just once. Just once, right? It will be the best holiday you have. I'm willing to wager on that. Despite all the doom and gloom you probably read in the news, on a probability basis, nothing bad's going to happen, right? You're going to have fantastic food, an enormous cultural experience, and I would argue the best red wine in the world.
Well, I was going to say Stellenbosch, Franschhoek,
Hop on the wine track.
No,
right?
yeah, completely. Oh no, that's good. But when you said plug, we actually had someone plug their own podcast, which I thought was pushing it. You know who you are, and but no, absolutely, that's going to be done. And that's an interesting book, actually. The wealth industry trying to work out what its own version of blowing up the Death Star or killing the Wicked Witch of the West, whatever that final slaying the enemy is. Okay. Well, I'll look out for that one. Thank you so much. Excellent choices, great word choices, Alex. Thank you so much for that. It's been a great conversation.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
And thank you all very much for watching. Please do look out for further Choice Words videos as they become available.